Hello. Let's talk about a couple of geology terms that are going to be useful throughout the class. So let's make this a little bigger. There we go. So the first term that you're going to want to know is clast or clastic. And just from the sound of the name, it sounds like something that is broken. These are rocks that come from the erosion of other rocks. And so you may see chunks of those other rocks, and they'll be cemented together again to form a new rock. And so that's a clastic rock. There are a lot of different kinds of clastic rocks. The stuff up here at the top, like conglomerate, is when you can see, great big chunks in there. We define these by the size of the clasts, the size of the weathered pieces of other geologic formations. And so if they are pebble size, and it's showing you a nice size guide here, then cement those together and it'll be a conglomerate or a breccia conglomerate if they are rounded and show a lot of erosion. Like if you took stones on a beach and glued them together. Breccia being more angular, like if you shattered stone then suddenly froze it, that's what you would get there. When we get things like meteorite impacts, those form breccias. Let's see. Then you got sandstone down here, and if you could break it down, and what you would have would be little grains of sand. There you go. That's what we call that. But also a variety of things, sort of everything in the blue and purple and pink down here, you could call shale if you like. So these are going to be made of very fine grains, which we would call silt, or extremely fine grains that if you dried them out would just be almost invisible powder. And that's what we call clay. And these actually preserve really nice fossils and do a great job. But they're all just versions of the same thing. Depending on the size of the clasts, they're all different clastic rocks. All right. Now, in addition to these clastic rocks, we have carbonate rocks. Carbonate rocks grow. They're deposited and cemented together quite often either with the help of living things or using the skeletons of living things if they happen to be there. Carbonate rocks are going to be predominantly made of calcium carbonate. And so here you can see some of the different names for different forms of limestone, for example, is kind of a continuous sort of chain of these, depending on how much biological material or what size pieces are being cemented together. The stuff that's cementing them is going to be calcium carbonate. You can recognize these in the field if you bring a little bit of acid with you, like a dilute hydrochloric acid. You put that on, it'll start to bubble a little bit, and that tells you you're dealing with a carbonate rock. So yeah, calcium carbonate, usually in the form of calcite. And over time, they can form nice little crystals and be compacted and make all sorts of wonderful geological formations. Limestones are very likely to contain fossils, quite often built from fossils. That's what these little yellow and purple things and the green things are. It is often difficult to get the fossils out of limestone, but you can sometimes section that limestone. Take a very thin slice of it, polish it, and then you'll be able to tell what it is that's actually making this up. All right. Geological units. The way we divide up the layers of the crust of the earth, basically, are organized, and we organize them in sort of a hierarchy. Yeah. Here's the hierarchy over here. So you've got a group, which is a great big thing. A group is going to be made of formations. So individual formations will have a succession of different beds that make up a formation, and you'll be able to recognize those because you'll have the same thickness with roughly the same fossils in them, kind of across the sort of length of that formation where it was deposited. There are only a few places where these formations actually surface and we can collect from them, but as part of gas and oil drilling, there are these core samples. Well, they'll take a little cylinder of rock that they drill down as far as they can, and you can read out the different layers of those cores. You can break it open at different points, look for microfossils along there, and look for changes in those rocks. So the term for those rocks is facies, which basically it's a particular type of rock. It's kind of a catch-all term for it. So you can say that you have like a siltstone facies, something like that. Shown here, this nice little map, it's showing all the different kinds of facies, or they'll use the word lithofacies, facies of rock, it's almost redundant, that they were able to find and identify. And they're showing you with the little dotted lines how they're correlating these facies across different areas. So each of the little cylinders of brighter colors is a core sample, and these are laid out along a line. You can see them up here. And so from that line, you can actually tell where each of these things is relative to the others. And these are describing basically a seashore. Over on this end, we would have the ancient seashore. Same thing on this end. In the middle, we'd have a big muddy sort of inland sea, and it's just filled in with all this brown stuff, which is essentially what used to be clay. So argillaceous clay shale, it's sort of broken down sand, clasts, and that's the Smithwick Formation over central Texas. So there's a website, and it's actually a database, but you reach it via this website right here. It's called GeoLex, and this has the official names for the formations and members and groups. So there are a lot of informally named rock beds here and there, and some of those appear in GeoLex and some of them do not. And so we would generally prefer to use the actual terms from GeoLex. Shown here, these are formations around Marble Falls, Texas, which is a little bit to the west of here, kind of over toward Austin. And so here we've got the Marble Falls Formation, here we've got the Marble Falls Group, and here we've got the Marble Falls Limestone, which is, I believe, synonymous with the Marble Falls Formation, or at least a unit of it. And this is back when it was called the Bend Group, but we don't use that term anymore, so it's in parentheses. And so we would tend to use the Marble Falls Group here instead of the Bend Group to describe those. And this table actually packs a lot of information. You've got a code that tells you when these things are from. And there's a separate little table that you can use to unpack these codes and figure out, roughly when are the boundaries that you can find these. Where do you find them? Which states do they appear in? Because sometimes you'll have the same formation at the same time, and it'll have a different name in different places. Oftentimes, these formations were described, and then later we figured out how to correlate them. And so, there are these great big charts. I'll show you one in a minute that say, all right, if you're in Texas, this particular formation has this name, but if you're in Kansas, it has a different name. If you're in Ohio, this one is equivalent to those other two, and so on. The dominant lithology is the type of rock that is most associated with that. So Marble Falls, it does tend to be this really thick, nice limestone, and so a metamorphic version of limestone is called marble. This is mostly just limestone as far as I can tell. I think people were using an imprecise version of that term when they named it, but it's named after the town, and the town's named after what presumably non-geologists thought of the rock there, which was pretty cool and still is. There's also an abbreviation, because why shouldn't there be an abbreviation? So MBLF, that's the Marble Falls Formation or Group or whatever. There you go. All right, let's go on. This is a beautiful thing. This is the Geologic Atlas of Texas. And shown here, you can see it in the top corner, this is the Abilene Sheet, and it's kind of centered on Abilene, Texas, is somewhere out over here. You'd have to zoom into it, and we'll do that on the next slide because I didn't put the full resolution on this one. But what you've got is a color code. And embedded in there, there's going to be these little shapes, and they're going to be letters. They're going to describe the formations. There's going to be a particular symbol for each one of those. Over on the side, you're going to see a stack showing you how each of these things is related. In some places, you'll have isolated beds, which are shown here, and it'll show you roughly where in the succession those things fall. These are very useful, and they will correlate the different formations over large parts of the world. This one just happens to be from Texas, which is where we are, and that's why we're looking at it. So let's zoom out a little more. There we go. So here we are, zoomed into this. Let's see. Take Cisco, Texas, right over here. It's, I don't know, about an hour, hour and a half west of Fort Worth. If you stay on the Route 20, which is actually helpfully marked here. And so if you wanted to see, all right, what formations would I expect to find if I were to go to Cisco, Texas, and follow, for example, what is now called Route 6 up here, which is right there. It looks like it used to be the Interstate 380. Oh, that's interesting. So here we go. P with a bar. Now, P with a bar means Pennsylvanian. And so then you have the PH here, and that'll tell you where you are in the Pennsylvanian. And so you come over here, you zoom in, you say, okay, PH. You can look on the little chart over here, and we'll have a full resolution version of this on the website. But the PPH is going to be the Harpersville Formation, and there it is, PPH, zoomed all the way in. So you can say, oh, okay, this is Harpersville Formation. You can say, fine, where's Harpersville Formation sit in the stack? You say, okay, it's part of the Cisco group, there we go, named after the place. Like, oh, that's okay. And so if you looked at the rocks on top of it, they would be Pueblo Formation. If you find the rocks underneath it, they're going to be Thrifty and Graham Formations. And these two have their own names. Thrifty is supposed to be the top, Graham is supposed to be the bottom, if I remember correctly. But they used to be considered distinct, and now they're kind of so muddled. Like the original descriptions made a couple of mistakes because, they couldn't see through the ground. And so now they're just the Thrifty and Graham undivided on these maps. Now there's even better. There is an interactive version. That's the one you want. And so if you go to this is called Texas Pocket Geology. You can go there, and it's a map, and you can zoom into any location on the map. You can click it, and it'll show you what formations you can find there. So let's see. We've got PW here. So if you want to see what P with a line is next to a W, you look over here, and I think that's probably the Wynn limestone, but let's see. Oh, no, there we go. Winchell limestone. There we go. Which the Wynn is a little bit newer than that, I think. And let's look at something different. So this horrible acid green color, the PPP, see it has a little bar here. It's pointing to this brown area over here. So this acid green has a K next to it. K is the geological abbreviation for Cretaceous, which starts with a C, but whatever. I think it's a K in German or something like that. And so this is much newer. This is like dinosaur age, and the Pennsylvanian stuff is way before there even were dinosaurs. And so you can see, that you had a succession. You had some formations laid down and then raised back up and tilted and eroded. So we go from older things on this side to newer things on this side. And then after that erosion, you had this refill in as an ocean during the Cretaceous, and you had a whole bunch of Cretaceous stuff that was deposited here and then eroded back down to some extent. And there you go. That's Texas. That's the story of Texas. So here's a correlation chart. It just shows that if you are in Texas, or if you're in central Texas, coastal Texas, Texas Panhandle, this is the formation that you'll find that's been mapped anyway. Here's what it corresponds to in the other parts of Texas. Here's what it corresponds to in the mid-continent of the U.S. Things like this are very, very useful, not just for paleontologists, but also for people in the energy industry who are trying to figure out. They're sort of chasing a particular pocket where they know there's a lot of fossilized fuel, basically natural gas, oil, something like that. And if they know which rocks they're in, they can tell how far down they need to drill in order to either pump some water in that to force the oil out somewhere else, or to actually extract the oil from that particular area. So, yeah, economically, very useful things. Okay, look at this chart. We can see a couple of things going on here. We've got divisions. Now, in North America and in every part of the world, there are local names for the ancient formations. These refer to time, but they're actually to a succession of rocks that were laid down during that time. So in the Pennsylvanian, which is the Upper Carboniferous on the international time scale, there are 5 periods, and so shown here on this one, they're just the bottom 3, the Morrowan, the Atokan, and the Demoinian. And these are named after places. Morrow is a place. I think it's up in Oklahoma, although you'd have to check that. Atoka is definitely up in Oklahoma. It's a little town in southern Oklahoma. And Des Moines is Des Moines in Iowa, where you get a whole bunch of rocks of this approximate age. So these were originally named as the rocks of the type that you get around a particular place. And for every formation, there has to be a type section, a place where that rock is exposed in a way that people can see it, or potentially a core sample that you've taken that is used to define that rock. You are a token if you are like the rocks in the correct order that you get around a toka. And so here's our lower, middle, and upper Marble Falls formation. Now, Marble Falls is actually just one formation. These units, the lower, middle, and upper, are informal designations which are used, but there's only one type section for all of the Marble Falls, and so they're all together, just like that. Yeah, so we've got time here, both local relative time. So if we're in the Morrowan, we know we're above the Mississippian, like the Chester series down here. And we know we're below the Atoka series, which is also part of the Pennsylvanian. So we know roughly when we are. And there's also a correlation to the international time scale right over here. And for the Upper Carboniferous, or Pennsylvanian, we're going to start with the Bashkirian, which is going to be equivalent to the Morrowan. So it'll go to right here. Then we'll have the Moscovian. These were named after Russian places. And so the Moscovian is going to be the Atokan and most of the Demoinian. Then we'll have the Casimovian. That's going to be the subperiod on top of the Demoinian, which is also known as the Missourian in North America. And then we're going to have the Gagalian, which is pretty close to the same boundaries as the Virgil series, or the Virgilian in North America. And there's another graph that shows the top of this in just a minute here. So, in addition to each of these formations, we have a rough idea of how deep the water was where these things formed. So if these are sedimentary rocks, they're generally going to be made from sediments that have come from the land or have just condensed, sort of calcium and carbonate that have come together in the ocean and then sort of fallen down as a little powder. So extremely deep water, you get those carbonates forming when the pH and dissolved mineral conditions are right. Closer to shore, you get this gradation of different types of rock. These inner shelf rocks, middle shelf, outer shelf, slope rocks, and then this sort of benthic stuff. And you can actually look at a formation and get a pretty good idea of how deep the water was, even without doing the fancy tests on it that geologists do. So, these formations are going to differ across time and space. And look at this. So you can have one formation laid down. So there's a particular event here. This little yellow event is this phosphatic glauconitic lime packstone. And it's weird, and it goes across the entire area. So you have this entire area flooded, and this particular unusual type of stone laid down. So that's our little correlating boundary. But then if you look at different places along that boundary a little bit later on, what you can see are a succession of sort of medium to deep water facies, and then sort of slope facies. This is a spiculite that's full of spicules, like the little bones you find from inside of sponge animals. And then up at the top, this green area here is it's fossilized algae, algal facies that you can find there. And you can identify the algae, and these are things that lived in very shallow water. And so, you've got areas where this was laid down and then areas where this was eroded away. So it was underwater and then above water, and then underwater and then above water. This stuff happens all the time in a tectonically active area or when there are big changes in global sea levels. Now, changes in global sea levels, as you might imagine, are going to be related to changes in global temperature. We'll talk later about how you can determine global temperature, or at least see changes in it from the rocks. But then look here. So we had this sort of thing. We have basically the shallows. We have a kind of a slope, the lower slope, and then we have this sort of deep water stuff here. And then we have an event, and you get this black stuff laid down over everything. You get mud rocks laid down over a basin. So something terrible happens, some sort of gigantic environmental change, and you got this basin laid down. And then on top of it, you've got a different kind, a very specific kind of rock laid down. Dvinella, it's called. This is a particular kind of calcium carbonate skeletoned algae. Yeah, and it's recognizable. And so we've got that. And then we lay on top of it, there's this bed. You've got some sort of event that lays down this gray bed, this sort of gray mud rock over top of it. And then on top of that, you've got a bunch of these spiculites, these sort of light blues. And then you've got areas where you have algae, so you know that must have been pretty shallow. You got areas where you get mud building up, these sort of clay shales, which think of those as like ponds, not particularly deep, but not close enough that they get rocks delivered to them in a rainstorm. You know, when the river rushes down and delivers its erosional material. And then over the top of this, you get another change when then everything, even the old algae layers, are covered by this sort of brown clay shale. So something changes again. And once again, you get everything, the entire ecosystem is wiped out and paved over with clay. And so we've had another big transition. These are probably correlated with big sea level rises and falls. And it's kind of neat. It sort of tells the story of this part. And you can read this entire thing, or at least look at the pictures if you want to. You can download it at that link over there. It's a really nice master's thesis. She did a heck of a lot of work, Stephanie Wood. And it is, about what's going on over central Texas and how it changed over time. And this is another one from her thesis, which I think is just fantastic, showing a little bit more what you expect to find and where you expect to find it. So here are these light and dark blues. These are burrowed packstones, which remember is a type of limestone, cemented. But they have lots of sponge spicules that you can see in them if you are sectioning them. And so sponges are not photosynthetic. Most of them do not have symbionts the way corals would. Like corals have these little photosynthetic partners, symbiodinium, that live inside of them and are necessary for the coral to live. Sponges aren't like that usually, but sponges do like to do a lot of filter feeding, and most of the stuff you can filter feed is found in shallow water because a lot of that is going to be catching and making its own food from the sun, basically. Then you'll get the little reefs. You'll get algal reefs, which are these light green and sort of darker green. Dvinella being the darker green and the lighter green being phyloid algae. These look like lettuce leaves, but made of calcite. They are calcium carbonate skeletoned algae, and they're still produced. They're not as common now, but they just used to make massive reefs. And then on top, you have these chytitid reefs, which are made of a sponge called chytites. And it's a particular sponge. It's got awesome little layers inside of it. We'll look at some in class. And those are only found in pretty shallow water. It's sort of in the intertidal zone where they're, sort of wet then dry, then wet then dry. And you get some of them in the subtidal zone as well. And they may have been a different variant, but pretty closely related as far as we can tell. And if you look down deep in this anaerobic environment, so the anaerobic layers tend to produce this. It's clay, it's black, and we call it black shale. And that's going to be a marker wherever you see that we're in pretty deep water, not too far from the coast. So things may die on the coast. They may, sort of roll down the hill in the storm, get pulled down there. And if they land in this anaerobic layer, they can get preserved as long as they're covered over pretty quickly, and you can actually get excellent preservation there. But maybe more importantly, it tells you a little bit about the conditions down there. So then, as now, there are not as many creatures, at least metazoan animals, big things, that are able to live in anaerobic environments. It tends to be mostly bacterial life down there. And it's a little harder to get metabolism going. A lot of the fastest growing things use oxygen for their metabolism. There are other ways to do this with molecular sulfur, for example, or with methane, or with iron, shifting between the different redox states in iron. Those are all viable ways to do respiration effectively that you find in a lot of bacteria. But most of the things that are closer to us are going to be aerobic, and so you'll find them up here. There you go. Here's a little bit of that time. So here we have the international version. So Gzhel in Russia, Kazimov in Russian, and Moscow in Russian, the Moscovian. And then underneath this is the Bashkirian, Bashkirian. And then if we're talking about the North American versions of these stages, we have the Virgilian, Missourian, Des Moines, Atokan, and the Morrowan is going to be underneath this. And together those make up the Pennsylvanian, which is half of the Carboniferous. It's the upper half, so we call it the Upper Carboniferous. That is the proper name. Here are the timings. When you use the international scale, there are calibrations of where these periods begin and end. And so the beginnings and ends are based on rocks that actually have been dated through geochemical methods. And so we don't know exactly when the Virgilian begins, but we know when it ends because it correlates with when the Gzhelian ends, and that's where the marker is. So, these are the rocks that we'll be looking in. This is how they correlate to rocks around the world. And this is the rough timing. And every couple of years, they'll go back and revise these timings, move the decimal point by just a little bit. But they're pretty solid timings, at least to the extent that they can be determined now. All right, and there are some of your questions. Carbonate rocks, name some examples. Oh my gosh, I think that was on the second slide. Geolex, I remember that from earlier. Let's see. From that picture, the Geological Atlas of Texas. See if you can find Ranger, Texas on that expanded map. This is north of Austin, west of Fort Worth, and it's over on the right-hand side, if I remember right, but around the middle of that map. And see if you can find the formations that overlie it or are closest to it. And then what group do those belong to, and what age would that be? And so you may need to Google around a little bit to get these, but that's doable. Terragenic, that means derived from the land. Oh, clastic, that means broken down rock that used to be part of the land. Like, facies, that means a kind of rock which has been formed, particularly in this case sedimentary rock. And so, unpacking those terms, bam, what do you expect from shallow water and deep water? What would a shallow water facies look like? What can we look for in a rock that'll tell us this is probably from pretty shallow or from pretty deep. Yeah. And we're not going to see all of these things, but you can get a pretty good idea just at a glance, just from Google Street View, for example. It's fantastic for researching potential fossil sites. Okay, what's a chytid? So these are relatives of chytites. Look back a couple slides, you'll see it. Yeah, the 5 North American series. So these are going to be the ones that start with the Morrowan, Morrow. How do those correlate with the 4 official stages? Those are going to start with the Bashkirian and then go on up through the Gagalian. And together they're going to make up the Upper Carboniferous. So see if you can get those things set in your mind. You can Google them. There's a nice Wikipedia page that'll walk you through all of this stuff. I'm not going to spoon feed you. You got to go find that, but it's not too hard. I bet you can do it. All right. Thanks very much. And this should give you a good idea of the sort of geology terms that we need to know. We're not really going to go any deeper into the geology. We are mostly going to stick to the paleontology, but fossils exist in rocks, and so it's going to come up from time to time. And this way, when we bump into those rocks, you're going to know what it is we're talking about. All right. Thanks very much.